Hello, and welcome back to Gist-ory. It is good to have you here. My name's Dave. First of all, I'm not a historian, I'm not an academic, just a regular fella who loves a good story, and here at Gist-ory, we're all about the stories. So, I might get a few details wrong, might miss a nuance or two, and I might get my facts all muddled up. But at the end of the day, with Gist-ory, you might not get the whole story, but at least you'll get the gist. And here we are in our Story of Britain, episode 13. We are going to be talking about the Victorian era. And this, for me, is the enduring image of Britain to people from around the world. This is what people think of. They still don't think that we've moved on truly from the Victorian era. And in some ways we have, and in some ways we haven't. It's the period when the British Empire arguably reaches its peak, and also where it sets the seeds for its eventual collapse and downfall. It's got all the excesses and all the lows of an empire at its very height. And at the centre of it all, we have an iconic queen, Victoria, who sets the tone of this era throughout her lengthy reign and remains a symbol of Britain to this day. She becomes queen at 18 years old. She becomes not only the Queen of Great Britain, but eventually the Empress of India as well. This is an era of politics. This is where the working people work towards getting a say in how the country's run. This sees a load of conflicts all over the world. There are so many inventions and innovations that happen in the Victorian period that we are starting to see the modern world emerge. But enough of the introductions. Let's get into it. This is the Victorian era of Britain. So where are we? Well, we last left it at the end of the Regency period in the previous episode. The year is 1820, and we're not technically in the Victorian era yet, because Queen Victoria isn't on the throne. King George IV is on the throne, and he was Prince Regent throughout the Regency period, which saw some major changes in itself, like how men and women met each other changed. For example, the waltz became a thing in dancing, which was shock horror, where you actually touched your partner on the waist and danced around. Scandalous. Breeches became a thing of the past, and trousers became a thing. Wigs eventually got phased out, and irregular hairstyles became a thing. And we start slowly moving towards tailcoats, hats, and petticoats, canes, and a reserved attitude will come to the fore as we go into the 19th century. And where are we in terms of the empire right now? Well, the British Empire is like the largest the world's ever known. They were in America till they got booted out. They're in Canada. They're in India. They're in bloody Australia on the other side of the world, which I should have really mentioned in a previous episode. Captain Cook discovered that in the 1770s when he landed in Botany Bay on the HMS Endeavour. And Australia started as what's called a penal colony, which is where if you got punished, one of your sentences in England could be that you got sent to Australia. But eventually it emerges from being just a penal colony into a community and starts actually developing as its own country. These are all things that are foundation for what we've still got in the modern day. The kings and queens of Britain are still the ruling monarchs in the Commonwealth, and changes are starting to happen. If you've been listening to the previous episodes, you've seen that the middle classes have started getting more influence in how the country's run, and they're starting to take power away from like the upper elites and things, because they're making all the money of the middle classes. They own the businesses, they own the land, they own the factories. But what we see in the Victorian era are the working classes, go on the working classes, are starting to get a voice. But that's for later. What we have during George IV's reign is a brief prime ministerial run for the Duke of Wellington, who was the victor at the Battle of Waterloo But he wasn't very popular at all because he couldn't get his head around the fact that a prime minister is like not an army general. He became prime minister and he was like absolutely against anything being modernized. And he's even quoted in saying, I gave them their orders, but they wanted to discuss them. And he didn't last very long. He only lasted for a couple of years from like 1828 to 1830. And he became known as the Iron Duke in this time because he was that unpopular and that rigid and treated the country like it was he was running an army, that he had to have iron bars put on his windows at Apsley House in his residency in London. And that's what got him called the Iron Duke. He was an Irishman, was Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. He was an Irish Protestant, but he also pushed through the Catholic emancipation, which tried to ease laws against Catholics, which turned his party against him and eventually did him in. He had to step down as prime minister. And some of the Irish are saying he didn't really go far enough, but it was at least a start, because the Irish are going to be in for a really, really rough ride during the 19th century, as we'll come on to see. George IV dies in 1830, and he doesn't have any children, so the throne passes to his brother, William, who becomes William IV. And what we get with the reign of William IV, kicking off from 1830, in 1832, we get the Great Reform Act. Now, bearing in mind that the kings and queens, they only have royal assent, which means that they can put the royal stamp of approval on laws, but it's Parliament that run the country. They get voted in by a very select group of people at the moment. Usually the really rich landowners. You have to own over a certain amount, and it's all based upon these medieval areas. So if you're a lord of a certain area, you might get a vote. But if you're like a middle-class worker in that area who's got loads of money, because you haven't got the position of power, you wouldn't get to vote a member of parliament. It's all very dodgy. But in 1832, there is the Great Reform Act, which means that the map of Britain gets reshuffled about and redrawn so that it includes different areas that have emerged, like big industrial towns like Manchester and Birmingham, who didn't have MPs, or they didn't really have a say in who was their MP, because it was all based on where medieval towns used to be. And in some instances, you had things called rotten boroughs, where landlords ran that part of the country, these upper class people, but no one was living on it. So they just basically decided, all right, well, we'll send some of my mates to be members of parliament for that. But there were no one living there because it were based on medieval maps. Well, this turns out on its head. And what it also means is that it expands who can vote in the elections. So it's not just your toffs anymore, your upper class, your middle class also gets to vote, but not a lot of them. You have to be earning over a certain amount. And very regrettably, because it's put in writing, it absolutely states it is male voters only, which means that women don't get a look in. Every now and again in the old system, women could vote if they were powerful enough, but not in this system, not in 1832 onwards, because it's defined you have to be a male voter and earning X amount, and that sets women back for years and years and years. But watch this space, because they'll make a comeback. Another major thing that happens in this era, or should I say from 1815 onwards, so the end of the Napoleonic Wars, is the Corn Laws come into effect, which is Parliament's way of saying, right, we need to make sure that our big landowners who own all these farms, all these rich people, who are growing all these corn crops and things, and corn basically meant any sort of grain, like rye and things like that. We have to make sure that it's really high value and that they're getting their sales in. So they banned everyone, or they really discouraged everyone from ordering in cheaper corn from abroad. You've got to buy British corn and grains from their wealthy landowners, because it were making sure the boys were looked after. And what they'd say is, well, Britain need a strong export, they need a strong corner of the market, and they decided it was these grains with the corn laws that were going to do it. But what that meant was it because it were really expensive to produce it in England for the very few who owned all the land. It made it corn prices go through the roof, made it really expensive, and it was so unpopular with factory workers because everyone's moving into cities now because things are starting to get industrialised. They can't afford it. A load of their wages are going towards it. Middle class are starting to kick off. It's like, what's going on? You're just looking after the upper classes here. But they'd argue with Parliament there saying, no, we need to have a strong backbone in this country with a strong economy. And what they were all about were, it's called laissez-faire economics, which means let it be, which basically means that apart from this massive restriction they've put in, let the markets do their thing. Just make sure you're in a strong position, but the markets will sort themselves out. It's a fact of life. The markets, the flow of money is just like a force of nature. You just need to let it happen as long as we make sure we're selling our best products. That will be a theme throughout this period. Another major act that happens during the reign of William IV is what's called the Factory Act. Now, one of the defining things about the Victorian era that you might be aware of, well, I reckon you will be aware of, is the world that Charles Dickens paints for us, which is the poor people of London and the rich people exploiting them and being really horrible to them. Not far from the truth, to be honest. Oliver Twist and all this sort of stuff. There were workhouses in the Victorian period, but the idea of it is that they didn't want, at the time this was the attitude, they didn't want the poor people of Britain to become dependent on the government because they thought that if you were poor, this was their attitude, it was because you were lazy, you were idle, and it were a character flaw. And it's something that you should be pulling yourself up by bootstraps and sorting out. These are all people who are in Parliament and have got all these businesses and whatever. They're saying the reason why you're not getting on in life is because you're lazy. So their idea was because middle class were peed off about having to give poor relief for these people who they just considered, with the attitude of the time, they were just layabouts and dossers. They said something has to be done here. We need things somewhere where poor can go, but they can contribute towards society. We're not just giving them out money for free. This is doing our heads in. So workhouses became a thing. Now, workhouses were these institutions that promised you somewhere to sleep, food in your belly, but the idea was they made it so unappealing to go into these workhouses that you would prefer to go out and get a job or beg on streets rather than go in there. The idea was they tried to put you off going to workhouses by making them horrendous, which they were. And all workhouses were designed to be backbreaking, really boring, or pretty much really dangerous. And poorest at poor people, because the gap between rich and poor, because at Industrial Revolution, where you had these mega rich landowning elites, middle class were all factory owners. You've probably seen pictures of them with big sideburns, big fat people, and, right stern expressions. And then you get the poor people on other end of it who are grafting themselves fingers to the bone to make these people rich. And the gap between rich and poor were just horrendous. So you had loads of people who were destitute and couldn't work. People who were like maybe too old or too infirm, or also you had things like children. They weren't educated. So these little street urchins, they just rounded them up and bang them in workhouse. You had people working, grafting on production lines, really dangerous equipment. And you had usually they'd send children into places where adults couldn't get to, like if there were a machine that's obviously rattling away and it's got all this basic machinery in it, but really dangerous stuff. Send a kid in there to go and unravel that cotton machine. Kid goes in, don't come out again, or comes out without an arm and stuff. It's just horrendous. So there was public outcry about this, and it forced Parliament to pass in 1833 the Factory Act, which limited child labour and mandated that everyone had to have an education. So what we're starting to see a push and pull, because it's the extremes of making money in the Victorian times. But what that as like a opposite and equal reaction to that, you had people who were like trying to be moral as well. It's like, no, we have to try and change this. It's not all about money. But in this period, the bottom line is what counted. And those were the workhouses. In 1837, William IV dies, and he doesn't have any children. So we look for the next in line for the throne. There's no direct male descendant except for William IV's niece, the daughter of Prince Edward, who's the fourth son of George III. This is the 18-year-old Queen Victoria, who comes onto the world stage in 1837. But what was she like? I mean, we see photographs of her and everyone in the Victorian period because you had to like stay really still and rigid. They all look miserable as chuff. But according to sources at the time, she was warm-hearted, lively, artistic, strong-willed, kept loads of journals throughout her life, had really like emotional sort of depth to her personality. And in this early Victorian period, she marries someone called Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. But in simple terms, that's somewhere in Germany. So she marries this guy called Prince Albert, and it is a match made in heaven. She is absolutely besotted with him. He's besotted with her. Together, they have 9 children who marry into European royal families. Throughout this marriage, she's happy, she's smiling, it's fantastic. They buy iconic family homes that the royal family still owns today, like Prince Albert buys Balmoral Castle up in Scotland, which is really, really iconic to the royals. Like Queen Elizabeth II went up there loads, and it's really linked to the modern royal family, is Balmoral. And they become the royal retreats. When you want to escape from the public eye, the royal family usually goes to Balmoral Castle. But she is the queen. Prince Albert, being a male figure, does become quite influential in her decisions, but it lays with her. At the end of it, she is the Queen of England, is Victoria. And she is the ruler of this vast, vast empire that, by the way, is still looking to expand into other areas. For example, we have a bit of an issue with China in 1839 when the East India Company go and have a chat with China and say, you know, we're making all this money and we're like the biggest trading empire in the world. We really love your porcelain. We really love your tea. We really love your silks and your style. Do you want to do a trade? China are like, well, what have you got to give us? And they're like, well, look at all these riches of the empire. You know, we take your pick. And China's like, you got nothing that interests us. What do you mean? No, I'm afraid there's nothing there that you've shown me throughout your entire empire that is something that we need. We can produce it all. China are obviously on top of everything. They are so advanced and so sophisticated. So East India Company are scratching their heads. How can we get hold of this flipping stuff that we want, this porcelain, this tea, these silks? Oh, I know. I tell you what we'll start offering your merchants. How's about some opium? China's like, absolutely not. And it's like, not sure your merchants will say the same thing once they get a little taster of it. And so opium and opiates, which are basically opiates are drugs that dope you, and it's commonly associated with painkillers, but probably most infamously associated with heroin, a highly addictive and destructive drug if it's abused. They grow it in like India and areas of Afghanistan that they're starting to move into, and they sell it to China through back door. And Chinese authorities are absolutely fuming about it because they get a population who hasn't been introduced to it hooked on this product and start to corrupt the people, because that's how they get into a trading agreement with the Chinese merchants. And China go to war with them. It's called the Opium Wars. So Britain and China get into this war because Britain's become a drug dealer. And guess what? Britain, being top dog at this time, wins not only the first Opium War, but there's a second Opium War that kicks off in the 1850s. And Britain wins that. And what do they get out of it? Hong Kong. So if you've ever wondered why there is a significant British presence in Hong Kong, why they drive on the left-hand side of the road over there, why there were a major base of the British, like say in the First and Second World Wars, it's because we won it in the peace agreement after the Opium Wars. You see, history's such a fascinating tale, but it's a dark tale at times. Going back in time to the 1840s, this is 1840 is the year that Prince Albert and Victoria are married. We have the Industrial Revolution getting into high swing. We have things like steam trains are being invented, railways, they're starting to overtake the canals that had been built before. The world is being transformed. We get something called the penny post system that comes up, which is the first beginnings of a modern postal service. Like I said, photography is being developed and produced. And we have a prime minister called Robert Peel, who is a Whig politician. Now, you have the Whigs and you have the Tories in the Houses of Parliament. The Whigs are more middle class, bit radical, like to make changes, and they don't like Catholics at all. They're very much for Protestants, whereas Tories are upper class landowners, but they're all for monarchy, and they stuck up in the past. They've got a history for sticking up more for the Catholic kings. They're still Church of England, but they're more open to maybe merging traditions with Catholics. But Catholics don't get a good deal here at all from anything that happens in Houses of Parliament at this time. And why I mention Robert Peel is he introduces to Britain a modern police force, which is the Metropolitan Police. Now, there start being this police force, this professional police force that starts being advertised, that starts the British policing system. People would call them initially peelers after Robert Peel. So, those are these peelers that he's been on about. But they also called them another word, which was they were bobbies, because a shortened version of Robert is obviously Bob or Bobby. And because it was Robert Peel who introduced the modern police force, policemen became known as the bobbies. Oh, that's what the bobbies are. It's what Bobby introduced. So that is why you have the British Bobby, who is the British police officer, introduced by Robert Peel, Sir Robert Peel. I beg your pardon. And he is a central figure to one of the most disastrous moments in the whole of the 19th century, which is the Irish potato famine. Now, if you followed this series, we have introduced Ireland in the past series, and to be quite honest, they have had the worst time of it because the majority of them are Catholic. There are some Protestant Irish, but that's after the Church of England under Henry VIII came over and started putting a lot of anti-Catholic laws in place. Over the years, this has got more and more. There have been conflicts between the Catholics and the Protestants, but Ireland is the majority of the island of Ireland. That's hard to say, but they're mostly Catholics, and there is a view from the English and the British, who are Protestant, that the Irish are wild and that they need civilizing. And the fact that the Catholic goes against them all the more because there's been so many religious conflicts in the past. And while the Napoleonic Wars were kicking off, so we're going back a few years now, there had been more and more suggestions of Irish people wanting a republic, wanting a break from Britain because of how they'd been treated, and they'd seen how the Americans had formed a republic and gotten away from British Empire. They've seen French rise up and saw that they got rid of their kings and became a republic for a time. And Ireland tried to do this in 1798, so we're going way back in a few years. Someone called Wolfe Tone, who was an Irish Protestant, because there was a Church of Ireland that the English preferred massively over any Catholics, but still the fact that they were Irish didn't do them any favours. But this is where the conflict changes from just being Protestant versus Catholic to the Irish people want a republic, because Wolfe Tone started an uprising with the French. He got some French support, tried to rise up in 1798, saying this is for an Irish republic, so we want a separate republic from Britain. It was disorganised. It got defeated by the British. Wolfe Tone got captured. He got put on trial for treason. He got found guilty. Wolfe Tone said, I am declaring myself a member of the French army, because he asked for French support. So you can't do me for treason. I want a soldier's death. British denied him that, said they were going to hang him like a common criminal, but he committed suicide before by cutting his own throat before they could do that. But that Wolfe Tone became a symbol of the Irish wanting to go for republicanism. It wasn't just a sectarian thing, Catholics versus Protestants anymore. He was arguing the Catholics and Protestants of Ireland want to be separated from Britain. But there was still this massive tension between the English and the Irish, with the whole Protestant Catholic divide. Gets very complicated, but it's important. So when the Irish potato famine happens, it's with all this in mind. So Ireland, there was an Act of Union between Ireland and Britain in 1800, which created the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. So the King of England ruled all of it. So in a way, Ireland is the responsibility of Britain to sort of support them and look after them. Well, most of Ireland was run by English landlords who wanted, because of the Corn Laws, remember, they're wanting to use as much of Ireland's available land for growing grains and wheat and grazing cattle. And the free people of Ireland, who were mostly Catholics, were pushed to the really rough areas of Ireland and had really small pockets of land. There were really small landowners. And the only thing that they could grow, these poor Irish people, to sustain themselves, were one crop, which is like a superfood, and it's the potato. It's like a marine. It can survive in any condition. You can grow it anywhere. It's really versatile, and it's really nutritious. And because of that, it's very basic, but a lot of Irish people just survived on potatoes alone. It's nutritious enough, though, that they were able to sustain themselves. And there was an increase to the Irish population there. Now, the Irish famine that hit in 1844 was a blight on the potato crop that made them all black and rotten and inedible, which meant that you had starving Irish people who go to the government for relief and they don't get enough. To start off with, there is a reaction to the crisis. People are starting to starve. People are desperate for relief. They can't afford the prices to pay for the British corn and wheat, and they're desperate to, what they're going to do. They just literally survived and sustained themselves on potatoes. So what the British respond by saying is, remember, they're all about workhouses, and if you can't work, you're just lazy and you're poor because of a choice, really. They're like, right, well, you can get yourselves into workhouses, can't you? Or we'll provide some relief for you, but you're not doing it for free. So what they do is they start public works in Ireland. So they start building roads, and in some instances, just for the sake of it, they go to nowhere to these roads. It's back-breaking work and everything, but they say, we'll pay you a wage, but you have to do this work. Well, the crisis becomes that massive, they can't sustain that, and they start turning people away. They're like, well, what am I meant to do? Well, you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, don't you? You need to find your own sort of relief. And British government do try and set up soup kitchens, and but because there's millions of people who are wanting them, it becomes economically unviable to do it. So they pack in doing that. And then private organisations like missionaries, Protestant missionaries, start setting up soup kitchens and make some of them, apart from the Quakers, who throughout all this story of Britain have been the heroes, in my opinion. They were the first to speak up against the African slave trade, and they offer unconditional support to the Irish during this famine. But a lot of the Protestant missionaries demand that the families either convert to Protestantism or allow them to teach their children Protestant ways. Causes massive issues in Ireland, as you can well imagine, and resentment. And so Robert Peel, who's Prime Minister, tries to solve this crisis by repealing the Corn Laws. I mean, there has to be so many protests and everything before he'll even entertain it, but people are starting to kick off because it's been an issue for years, but you're now watching an entire country just die in the thousands, and it'll become the millions before the end. And so he repeals the Corn Laws, but it's the end of his political career, basically. So Robert Peel's a Tory, and his party's the Tory party, and because they're landowners, they're all saying, "No, we're landowners. We're not repealing these Corn Laws." And so what Robert Peel has to do is he has to get support from Whigs who are opposite party, which splits him from the Tories. And he obviously takes a few Tories with him to Whig side, and he's got a big opponent in the Tory party called Benjamin Disraeli, who is saying, no, we need to stand by our principles. We fall and die on our principles. Robert Peel is absolutely breaking with our traditions and what have you. You know what we think about poor people, that they need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And Irish are still dying as these debates are going on. The Corn Laws do get repealed, but it's still affecting Irish to the point where a lot of them have no choice because they can't afford the rent on their land. Because there's a guy who's in charge. He's a civil servant. He's called Lord Charles Trevelyan, and he sounds like an horrible bloke. He's in charge. He's part of the ministry that's in charge of the Irish famine relief, and he's of the opinion that, well, it were overpopulated anyway, and it needs thinning out, and they need to. He's really a strong proponent of it's just them being lazy, and they just need to sort out another way to feed themselves and all this sort of stuff. He thinks it's God's way of saying that the Irish population needs thinning out, and obviously these Corn Laws are still in effect, and the British landlords are keeping their prices high and what have you. And if you've ever been to Ireland, or if you've ever heard the songs in Ireland, I have. I've been to Dublin and what have you. And the Irish have some of the most beautiful music ever, but it's so sad if you listen to it. And I think there's such a tragedy in the Irish story that's permeated through the years. And if you've heard a song called, it can bring a tear to your eye even now. It's called "The Fields of Athenry," and there's a line in that song which is, "You stole Trevelyan's corn so the young might see the morn, and now a prison ship lies waiting in the bay." And this is what it's referring to. Lord Trevelyan is sort of wanting to keep the Corn Laws with the prices so high, so people are being forced to try and steal the corn so that the kids can live, and they get arrested for it. And rather than, they're dying in the thousands, but rather than die, what the Irish have to do is they look for a new life in America, and they emigrate. I think the number's about 1 million. I think at the end of it, there's about 1 million dead, and there's 1 million emigrated, and they sail over in the former slave ships because African slavery got outlawed in 1833. So these ships that were used to transport slaves once upon a time are now being used to transport loads of the Irish to America. And some of the Irish landlords basically forced them into this. When I say Irish landlords, I mean the British who were running the Irish estates. They lived in Britain because they couldn't pay the rents. They were told by British government when Robert Peel eventually gets ousted as Prime Minister for repealing these Corn Laws. They say, right, people who've got lands in Ireland, it's your responsibility to sort this crisis out. And how do British landlords respond? If they don't pay the rents, they kick them off the land. And Irish have got, well, they've got three options really. They either die and starve, or they somehow try and get some food either by stealing or appealing for relief from these charity groups. Some of them who were asking them to renounce the Catholicism, or they emigrate to America. And this is what happens. And then you have New York, which becomes a hub. Well, you get, Boston and New York and things like the New England area of America becomes the areas most populated by these Irish immigrants, and because of the Irish famine. And it obviously leaves a massive lasting legacy to this day. When Robert Peel splits the party, Benjamin Disraeli forms the Tories into the Conservative Party that are more back to the traditional values of the Tories and are looking to modernise in a way. He's got a load of energy and a load of new ideas for this Conservative Party. And it does start to include like more of the middle class, because after the Reform Act, where middle class are getting a bit more of a say in government, they've got to appeal to more people. So this new Conservative Party that's come out of the Tory Party is looking to like go into the future with that. And that's where we'll end part one with the Irish famine causing devastation in Ireland, the repeal of the Corn Laws, and the formation of the Conservative Party under Benjamin Disraeli after Robert Peel gets ousted. The Irish famine it starts to subside in 1849. The crops start to recover and everything, but I don't think the country would recover for years and years and years. And it does set a resentment in place and a new drive to what would become an issue of home rule. But more on that later. When we come back, we'll be looking at the Great Exhibition, the Great Game, the Crimean War, and the Indian Revolution. See you soon. Welcome back to Gist-ory, where you might not get the whole story, but at least you'll get the gist. This is part 2 in our story of the Victorian Era. And the year is 1851, and we start off with Prince Albert's great idea, the Great Exhibition, which is the first of the world fairs, which is basically just a massive chance for Britain to show off. It took place in somewhere called Crystal Palace in London. You might know the football team called Crystal Palace. They're based where the Crystal Palace was located. It was a huge building made of glass where all these exhibits were placed inside. There were over 100,000 exhibits, which were literally to show to the world the grandeur of the British Empire. It had like stuffed elephants in there. It had steam trains, exotic diamonds. It had everything. It even had like a flushing toilet in there to show off the ingenuity of the British. And it's said to have attracted 6 million visitors. It was like the event of the day. All the celebrities of the time went there, like Charles Dickens and Queen Victoria herself. All of them. It was the event because Britain was riding high. It was engaged internationally in the Great Game with Russia. That's what it was called, where the Ottoman Empire, which was the empire that it was based in Turkey, but it like ruled all of the Middle East, and it was a huge empire back in the day. It was starting to decline, and Russia was starting to pick away at it. It was like trying to get bits of where it used to be, like in Afghanistan and the Middle East and what have you. And the Great Game was between Britain and Russia. Who was actually going to get there? Who was going to have their influence over it? It was a bit like how Russia and America in the Cold War fought against each other. Well, this is Britain's obviously the big noise back then, and they're getting involved. But France teamed up with them, and there was a small war within the Great Game called the Crimean War. Now, Crimea is a little peninsula that sticks out the bottom of where Russia's European part is into the Black Sea. And the Black Sea is like an internal sea, and it borders like the north of Turkey, which is where the Ottoman Empire was. So that little peninsula of Crimea is where Britain and Russia were having their little war. And during the Crimean War, you have big sieges, like you have the Siege of Sevastopol, and you have the Battle of Balaclava, which is legit the name for it. It's not just a piece of headwear. And during that battle, the British were at the bottom of this ridge, and the Russian cannons were firing at them, and they didn't know what to do. So this is where you get the charge of the Light Brigade, the legend of it, where they knew that they were going to die, but they got ordered, go and get them big Russian guns at top. And they were like, well, we're going to get slaughtered. But the Light Brigade turned round and said, ours is not to reason why, ours is but to do and die. And they charged up towards the Russian guns and got massacred. But during the Crimean War, you have figures that emerge that become famous throughout the period. You have Florence Nightingale, the Lady of the Lamp, who invented modern nursing, which was based upon a scientific approach to nursing, which is hygiene, improved sanitation, wash your hands. She was the Lady of the Lamp. She made it into a profession, nursing. And she actually, after the war was over, in 1860, she founded the first school of nursing, which was St. Thomas Hospital in 1860. Another female figure of that time, a nursing figure, was Mary Seacole, who was a Jamaican woman who came to Britain, and because she was a person of colour, she tried to join into the nursing corps and was rejected. So what did she do? She went out to the Crimean War herself, to the front lines herself, and went out and gave aid to the frontline soldiers. They started calling her Mother Seacole. And she looked after them. She kept their spirits up. She fed them. And she's rightly celebrated these days as a real pioneering figure in the history of nursing. Her and Florence Nightingale were both nurses of the time. But the thing that obviously stands out is that Mary Seacole was a person of colour in a time where that was a real issue for a lot of people. You had many medical discoveries during this time. Like you had the theory of disease that came about called epidemiology, when John Shaw discovers cholera has a waterborne transmission. So it's not the mystery is starting to get unravelled within society of how things actually work through a scientific approach. You have people like Charles Darwin who present the theory of evolution to the Royal Society. You have engineers like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who is the great bridge builder, the great innovator. He builds the Great Western Railway. He builds a tunnel underneath the Thames River. You know, him and people like him build the London Underground. I mean, it's a train under the chuffing ground. How the hell did they conceive of these things back then? It's just amazing, amazing engineering feats and progressions that are made in this time. And you also have, as much as you're having the progression, you're also having the overturning of old institutions like the East India Company. Now, in our previous episodes, we've described the rise of the East India Company, how they moved from being a trading company, a rather aggressive trading company who settled in India, to becoming basically the government of Eastern India. They won battles in India. They had private armies, which were mostly filled with sepoys who were native-born Indian people in their armies who were really brutal to, really harsh with, but they formed them into a fighting force. And they won a couple of key battles in India, which we went into in the previous episode on the Georgians, which meant that they were granted the right to Diwali. Now, that's the tax system. Now, once they've got control of the tax system, it means that they can start interfering with policy, because they set the tax rates, they give the rulers of India what they believe their share should be, and then they keep the rest. And so then they start, because they're getting so influential, they start telling people what to do, they start exerting their power over them, and they start becoming massively unpopular. The population of India start to resent them. because they start interfering with their religious practices. You have Muslims and you have Hindus in India. They start having Christian missionaries come in, and a few of the practices of the Hindus and the Muslims start to be ignored. The treatment of the Indian sepoys who are working in these private armies is really, really harsh. And they start getting looked into by British government towards end at 1700s, actually. They start saying, who do you think you are? You're not a trading company anymore. You're like more a country in your own right, ruling over India. And so governments start like taking a look into their books and things like that. And they, in early 1800s, they say, right, we're not giving you monopoly anymore on East India trade. We're going to allow other companies to compete with you. And that knackers them up because they've moved away from being traders now. They've just relied on having monopoly. And now other people are starting to nip away at their trade, and people are starting to get annoyed with them in India. And what really starts to get the goat Indians is they've got this law in place where if any of the local rulers die without an heir, it automatically, their land goes to East India Company. And there is a spark that kicks off the Indian Mutiny where they get issued with new rifles, do the sepoy troops, and your bullets come in packets, but they're held together by like grease paper. And there is a rumour that goes round all the ranks saying these new rifles and this new grease paper that you're being asked to do, it's got pig and cow fat in the grease. Now, cows to Hindus is sacred, and Muslims see pigs as unclean. So they think that this is the final insult of all these transgressions that East India Company has been doing, and this is straw that breaks camel's back. And they rise up against East India Company in a massive mutiny and just absolutely tear into all the held, probably about 80 to 90% of Indian sepoys in private army at East India Company rise up, turn on East India Company, and East India Company are just desperate for help from British government, who already are thinking that these cowboys and what have you. And they managed to come in at British government and sort of stabilise the situation with regular British troops. They managed to sort of calm down the mutiny that's just erupted, but at the cost of, right, East India Company, all these lands you think you've got, you're transferring them to British Crown, and the British government takes all the land from the East India Company. They stabilise the sepoy regiments because they start mixing the sepoys, the Indian-born troops, in with the regular troops from Britain, so that it's not as easy for them to actually rebel or revolt. And the East India Company gets elbowed out, and it becomes what's known as the British Raj in India, which means British rule. And how the British do that is they allow the owners, the local rulers of India, to get on with it, but basically under their supervision. And they just have a small presence, the British, mainly in Bengal, and rule over it from there. And they create the Viceroy of India as an office. And they bring all civil service under their control. So if you want country to run right, British have got all these systems in place. So British Raj is now in power in India, and the East India Company collapses. Back in England in 1859, we have the Liberal Party that's formed. And this is formed between those followers of Robert Peel, who left Tory Party. It's the old Whig Party and radicals. They all unite and they create the Liberal Party under someone called William Gladstone, who I really like. He's a reformer, he's a humanitarian, and he tries to sort of bring positive changes to the era. And his big opponent at the time are the Conservatives. So we now have the Liberal Party against the Conservatives, who are the two dominant parties in Houses of Parliament. William Gladstone is the leader of the Liberal Party. Benjamin Disraeli is the leader of the new Conservative Party, who are updated Tory Party. And they, throughout this period, basically swap who's being Prime Minister. One becomes PM, then next one becomes PM, then they're the big political figures at time, Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone. Disraeli's all about keep the empire going, keep the traditions going, rule Britannia, etc. Gladstone's like, we need to be fair to everyone, we need to make sweeping changes and what have you. So it's a push and pull between them two. However, for our monarch, Queen Victoria, the darkest year of her life comes around, which is 1861. Prince Albert, the love of her life, dies at the age of 41. And Victoria, who's had 9 children with him, the happiest years of her life, she never, ever gets over it. And she goes into a period of like mourning and retreats from public life and constantly wears black, which is probably what people associate her with. You know, she's got this very sort of serious expression. She always wears black. She's never in public. And this is all because she is so upset and grieving over Prince Albert dying. She never ever gets over it. But there's action happening in the Houses of Parliament because the political machine's churning and churning. There's a second Reform Act that's been pushed in Parliament by Benjamin Disraeli and the Conservatives, who, by the way, Benjamin Disraeli is the first and only to date Jewish Prime Minister. He has pushed the second Reform Act, which expands the votes to even more people, which includes working class men in the urban areas of England. This just shows you how he's trying to modernise the Conservative Party to actually represent everybody, not just the upper class landowners who it's mostly made up of. And around this time, while working class men are getting the vote, there starts to become the first mass women's suffrage petition. Now, suffrage is the right to vote. Men's suffrage has already happened, obviously, but women's suffrage is starting to be petitioned. And we see in 1866, just before this second Reform Act is passed, which gives the vote to urban working class men, 1866 is the first mass women's suffrage petition to Parliament, which doesn't go anywhere just yet. The following year, in 1868, William Gladstone becomes the Prime Minister, of which he'll become Prime Minister 4 times. And he's all about moral changes and administration changes. He's the head of the Liberals. And we enter into basically the high point of the Victorian period. There's an Education Act that's passed, which requires compulsory education and schooling for all children. In 1871, trade unions become legal, which leads to social reform. And in 1872, the Secret Ballot Act is passed, which absolutely transforms voting. And why is this? Because before that act gets put in place, when you voted, it were out in public. Everyone knew who you'd voted for. They could bully you. They could stand over your voting desk and see who the chuff you were voting for, beat you up, bribe you, whatever. It were corrupt as hell. But with this Secret Ballot Act, it means that you can vote for who you like and no one knows about it. And this means that if you've got a really rich landlord who wants you to vote for, say, the Conservative Party because they're all about pushing stuff that'll help him, but you want Liberals to get in or another agenda that you want on the table, before he could see who you're voting for and could threaten you with kicking you off his land and all this sort of stuff if you don't go where he wants you to. But now he don't have a chuffing clue who you're voting for. So he can say to you, make sure you vote for Conservative Party or whatever, because you're my tenant and whatever, you're here by my good graces. You could say, oh, yes, my lord, oh, yes, we're bringing your hat in your hand, and then go and vote for whoever you want. It transforms everything, and it especially helps the Irish because they are under the thumb of British landlords who would always make sure they voted for who they wanted them to vote for. But now it means the Irish can vote for Irish rights. And that's where we'll end part 2 with the secret ballot being introduced. In part 3, we will be covering Queen Victoria being made Empress of India, the scramble for Africa, and the struggle for Irish home rule. See you soon. Welcome back to Gist-ory, where you might not get the whole story, but at least you'll get the gist. This is part 3, and we're in the year 1874. Benjamin Disraeli and the Conservatives are in power, and as the Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli is now about imperial policy. He's about the glory of Great Britain, and he has a real good relationship with Queen Victoria. She finds him very charming. He's very nice to her. She's obviously withdrawn after she's still grieving and never will get over the death of her beloved Prince Albert, her husband. But he is like the best friend you could hope for. He sends her letters, he goes to see her, and she's very, very fond of him. And in his quest to make Britain stay top of the tree in terms of empires, in 1875, Britain, under the Disraeli government, buys shares in the Suez Canal, which gives them a controlling interest in it. He creates the Public Health Act. And in 1876, he declares Queen Victoria Empress of India, which is the symbolic peak of the British Empire. Britain rule over India as the British Raj, with the Viceroy of India. It's the period in time when the sun doesn't set on the British Empire. It stretches from Canada to presence in South Africa, to India, to Hong Kong, to Australia. There is always a part of the British Empire where it is daytime because it is all over the world. It's a leader in industry. It's a leader in innovation. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell presents the telephone. Bicycles are invented. The early radios are invented. Motor cars, towards the end of the century, will have X-rays invented. And the empire doesn't stop growing. It just increases and increases. For example, in 1884 to 1885, there is a conference in Berlin, and there is what's known as the Scramble for Africa. The countries of the world have decided that with these new industries, there are all new resources that are needed, like rubber and things that, and obviously more raw resources that are needed to keep the fires of industry burning. And Africa is unclaimed territory. So they decide they're going to divide it amongst the great powers. The scramble for Africa begins in the mid-1880s with the British occupying Egypt, Sudan, and South Africa, which causes conflicts in South Africa, particularly with the Boers who are there. Now, the Boers are the remnants of Dutch settlers, French Protestants, and Germans who have all formed together into a community that they call themselves Afrikaners. And with British being down there, it causes loads of tensions because British, as the British do, they're trying to set up a presence there, make it part of Commonwealth. Afrikaners don't want it. Obviously, they're in Egypt as well at British now. They've got shares in Suez Canal. There's just no stopping this empire. And with Queen Victoria becoming the Empress of India, she is the symbol of all this. But while this is all going on, there are rumblings at home and abroad. For example, in 1871, the states of Germany had all formed together under Otto von Bismarck to create the country of Germany. Now, this is a bit of a nightmare for everyone in Europe because Prussia was the big Germanic state and all the other Germanic states were like all separated from it. But now that they've formed together, they are a huge threat to what's called the balance of power in Europe. And they have a big war with France, which is called the Franco-Prussian War, which eventually, once Germany becomes its own country, it just shows how dominant the Germans can be, how good they are at industry. And this will have real repercussions for our next episode when we build up to the First World War. But this is all going on in the background while Britain's having its little high point in the sun, having its little pat on the back of being the greatest empire the world's ever known. There are contenders starting to form, particularly in the formation of Germany. There are also rumblings among the working class. particularly there's a new movement that started. There were loads of revolutions that happened in Europe during the mid 1800s. And one of the key figures that comes out of this is someone called Karl Marx, who is a German who creates something called the Communist Manifesto. And his idea is that the workers should be prioritized. And what communism turns into, our modern understanding of it, is that everyone should share the benefits of the workers amongst themselves. Everything should be shared out. It's a socialist, far left policy, and it's seen as massively dangerous and disruptive because it's all about the working class getting exploited by the ruling classes, and it urges revolution to empower the working class. And it finishes with saying, workers of the world, unite. And it went into suggesting you should nationalise, as in bring under control of the people, all the transport, the communication, never have inheritance taxes, and have free public education. And that would have real consequences when we get particularly into the Second World War, but in the 20th century onwards, really. But he comes to Britain and lives in London after releasing his Communist Manifesto in 1849. So it just shows you that there were such rumblings going on. But in 1884, there is the third Reform Act that takes place to decide who the voting body is going to be. And it expands the electorate again to include the working classes, the rural working classes. They've bowed under pressure of the middle classes and upper classes. Working classes are finally getting their vote, but working class men. This is when trade unions and socialist ideas start to take shape, particularly the ideas of like Karl Marx are at the front of these socialist ideas, the communist ideas. But again, women are excluded. There's also the burning issue of Irish home rule that becomes a real centre point in these progressive ideas. William Gladstone introduces it after being inspired by nationalists, Irish nationalists, Isaac Butt and Charles Stewart Parnell, who have been using the advantage of the secret ballot that's been introduced to get a huge following and votes for people sympathetic to the Irish ruling themselves into Parliament, so they can't ignore it. And they managed to form within Parliament, does Charles Stewart Parnell, the Irish Parliamentary Party, which is all about arguing for Irish Home Rule. So they managed to inspire William Gladstone, who's now the Prime Minister again of the Liberal Party, to suggest it, and it splits the Liberal Party in two, and it gets defeated in the House of Commons in 1886. It gets defeated because the British are worried it's going to break up Britain, because remember, it's Great Britain and Ireland is what the sovereignty covers. In 1893, they try a second time for the Home Rule Bill. It gets passed in the House of Commons this time, but the House of Lords defeats it because it has to go through the House of Commons, then it has to pass the House of Lords, then it has to get signed off by the King. So it gets through the Commons, but the Lords block it. And Irish are absolutely maddened by this. And Conservatives who blocked it are saying, look, we'll give you concessions and things. You don't need Home Rule. We'll give you all these reforms and what have you. But Irish are determined. And the Conservatives are sticking up for the people of Northern Ireland who are in Ulster who don't want Home Rule, because they're thinking, we get Home Rule, all Catholics are going to be in charge. So they want to remain part of the United Kingdom. Nationalists want Home Rule, and the Unionists in the north, who are Protestants, want to remain with Britain. This becomes the crux of the issue. Liberals are trying to get Home Rule passed through for Nationals. Conservatives are against them, wanting Union to stay together. It's a right mess. And we're going into the next episode a little bit, but they eventually get a third Home Rule bill on the table in 1912 to 14, which gets passed. But it gets suspended because the First World War breaks out, and that's when everything shifts towards Irish saying, right, we're going to become a republic. They were pushing for home rule, as in we'll still be a part of the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland as long as we get home rule and we get a say over what the destiny of Ireland is. But as soon as the third time when it gets passed over because First World War starts and then everyone just forgets about it, they say, right, we're going to become a republic. But that's for next time. That's not the only political issue that's going on. We have women who are still fighting for the right to vote, especially since in 1893, New Zealand, which is obviously a British colony, other side of the world, grants women the right to vote, but they're not allowed to vote back in Britain. And in 1894, there's parish and district councils become a thing. They get created. And women are allowed to vote in these, but not allowed to vote for who government is. So that's when they start really ramping it up a gear. And in 1897, you have someone called Millicent Fawcett, who's not militant, but she forms the National Union of Women's Suffrage to campaign for women's rights to vote. And again, we're creeping into the past the Victorian era. But we have in 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst forms what we know as the suffragettes, who are militant, who are saying, we're not asking anymore, we're telling you, we are getting the vote. In 1918, they partially achieved this when Parliament say, all right, you can vote, but only women over 30. Voting age is 21. They're not happy about that. The women of Great Britain keep campaigning, and in 1928, they get equal suffrage. They get the right to vote. Women over 21, same as men, get an equal say in who runs the country. The suffragettes are triumphant. But going back to the Victorian period, the empire, as great as it is, still has issues within it. We have the Boer War that kicks off in 1899. Why? Because gold gets discovered in Africa and the Boers are on the land where the gold is. So British are like, give us that gold. Afrikaners are like, get stuffed. So Boers start fighting British in a guerrilla war, small war, because British have got all this technology and whatever, the might of the empire behind them. And British respond by basically starving out the Boers. They do a scorched earth, which means that they burn all farms and they burn all food, and they start setting them up in concentration camps. Yes, those are work camps that are designed for prisoners of war. And the British are triumphant and they absorb the Boer republics into the British Empire. And coincidentally, there was a certain figure who was active in the Boer War, who was a war correspondent who was writing for the Morning Post. And it was a young officer called Winston Churchill. He actually got captured during the Boer War and did a daring escape and actually escaped from a prisoner of war camp in Pretoria after a train got ambushed that he was on. And then he joined back up with South African Light Horse. So that was a story for him to tell, but he would have a greater story to tell later in his life. We're not quite there yet, but it's coming. But before we say hello to the heroes of the future, we now have to say goodbye to a heroine of the past. In 1901, Queen Victoria, Empress of India, Queen of the British Empire, dies in 1901. And with that, brings the curtain down on the Victorian era of Great Britain. She's succeeded to the throne by her son, to Prince Albert. Edward VII becomes king in 1901 at the dawn of the 20th century. And that is where we will end our episode. In the next episode, we will be looking at the build-up to the most destructive conflict the world has ever known, the Great War, World War I. So that might not be the whole story of the Victorian era, but hopefully that is the gist. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. This is a labour of love. It's a work in progress. If you can suggest anything to make this better, I'd welcome any comment you'd wish to make. Just leave me a comment below this video or in the comments section. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you want to talk about history, if you want to discuss anything that I've said or Give me any suggestions. I welcome any sort of feedback you can give me. If you've liked this episode, please give us a like and a thumbs up. If you want more content, please subscribe to the Gist-ory channel. Really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me ramble on. As I say, I'm not a historian or an academic. I do this for the love of a story, and I really enjoy doing these episodes, as rough and ready as they are. But as much as I've enjoyed it and as fun as it's been, I'm afraid that's all the time we have, and this episode is now history. Until next time, take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, ta-ra!